Welcome, everybody. We're about to start the session, so I'll ask our speakers and our participants to please take their seats. Thank you. And welcome you all to this session on Participation for Peace, Women's Agency in Conflict and Humanitarian Crisis. My name is Comfort Aero, President and CEO of the International Crisis Group. There was supposed to be information on the screen. I'm waiting for the organizers to put it back up. We have a special QR code that you can scan onto your telephones and enables you to ask questions to our distinguished panelists, who I will shortly introduce. There we go. To pose questions during this debate, please join on this QR code, and you can pose your questions, and it comes onto my tablet here, and I get to see all your questions. So we're very technology and digitally advanced here, so nothing can go wrong as well. But it's a real honor to be in the presence of three very distinguished women. To my immediate left, Madam Minister, Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs, Madam Omano from Kenya. It's a real pleasure to be moderating a session with you, and I'm very, very pleased about that as well. And to my immediate left, we have Madame Karma as well, Chairwoman, Women Journalists Without Chains, Nobel Peace Prize Laureate 2011. Congratulations as well. And then my dear friend, really, we've been sort of tag teaming these last 48 hours, so it's really nice to be on the panel with you again. I'm going to make a facetious comment because I think I'm allowed to do that as a moderator of the session. I'm always struck about when we have conversations about women that there are never men on the panel as well. Yeah. So gentlemen, please make sure that that you consider yourself as part of this panel, because there's a sense in which we have to spend time talking about ourselves. And I think 22 years after 1325, I'd like to think that the conversation should not just be limited to women talking about women's agencies, but it should, be representative of all society, and it will be good to conceive a table that is truly representative of the challenges that we face in peace and security as well. My next facetious comment as well, again, 22 years after 1311, is a sense of déjà vu, that we're still asking ourselves that questions about women's agency. And one of the things I'd really like from the panelists as well is if we can have a conversation that takes us beyond that familiar conversation about the rights of women at the peace table, making sure that international instruments are addressing the role of women, but to actually talk specifically about what is happening on the ground and what you have seen, what you've observed, the challenges, the weaknesses, the opportunities, whether the women, peace and security agenda has really advanced us any further since 1325, and also for us to really have a practical understanding of what this sort of international feminist foreign policy is about in practical terms. I want us to get beyond the headlines, beyond the quotable quotes, but to really understand what is happening on the ground, and especially the two of you, because you're at the front line. But Minister, I mean, you have a seat at the table as well. You are among sort of key players, and you're a decision maker as well. And it'll be very curious to hear from your vantage point how you see the issue of women's agency and participation being played out in your own work, and as you begin to implement and push for Kenya's own foreign policy, how you see women's agency playing out in the field, especially 22 years after, getting over that déjà vu. I'd be interested to understand your own understanding of how you see women's agency right now in the foreign policy arena as well.
Well, thank you for the question. I hope you can hear me
Yeah.
clearly. Yeah. And thank you for inviting me to this panel. You asked about the 20-year journey. I'll say this, that war has changed, the circumstances of women have changed, and therefore we have to interpret 1325 differently. The conversations that we've been having in Kenya of late are around the impact of rapid urbanization and the peace and women, peace and security agenda. And what we've realized is that war is moving into the cities, and women are moving into the cities, and they're moving into the cities as refugees, they're moving into the cities as IDPs, they're moving into the cities as vulnerable groups, because they're running away from conflicts that are taking place either generated by terrorism, or they're just moving into the cities because of poverty. And consequently, we need to ask ourselves, as war and as the desperation of women moves into our cities, and if we are thinking about Africa in 2050, we will find that 60% of Africa's population is living in cities. But the question is, how do we advance the agency of women as wars and humanitarian crises move into built-up spaces? And what should be the role of women as we are looking at issues pertaining to integration, disarmament, relief, and prevention within a different setting? You know, you're just as likely to be gang raped in an informal settlement in a city in Africa as you are out on the war front. So the question is, what are the safeguards for women in places where you have desperation, ungoverned spaces, and in areas where we are not thinking that women are vulnerable? So for us, this is a discussion we've been having in Kenya and on the African continent. We raised this issue recently at the Africa Peace and Security Council because it's an issue that we must raise at the next conference we're going to have on the new urban agenda in New York in April. We must find this nexus between women, peace and security, and rapid urbanization, the impact it's having on women's lives, their vulnerabilities, and we must take into account that war in cities actually exacerbates the vulnerability of women. So these are the new issues, and that's why I'm saying that Resolution 1325 can't be static. We can't be looking at it from the same lens. We have to understand that we're living in dynamic times, and we have to think about it differently, and we have to talk about the issues that are affecting us, and not the textbook ones. Yeah. So that's something I'll throw into the arena. Maybe somebody can pick it up from there.
Well, before I throw it to somebody else, I wanted to ask you specifically, what does this mean for 1325, and what would you want to see differently in terms of policy? I was curious that you mentioned the AU Peace and Security Council. What conversation precisely are you bringing to the AU, and what would you like to see as the outcome of that conversation, especially at a multilateral, continental level?
What I'd like to see is more attention being placed on rapid urbanization as a national security problem. It's a national security problem because urban fragility leads to state fragility. Fragile states lead to conflicts, and any conflict is a threat to international peace and security. So we have to elevate, we have to securitize rapid urbanization. Then we have to look at the way in which rapid urbanization either empowers or disempowers women. And we have to look at women as victims of war in cities, victims of conflict within cities and in urban spaces, whether they're refugees or they're just women who are running away from other parts of Africa, for instance, and coming in as migrants into our cities. They all come with different sets of vulnerabilities. So what we'd like to see is we'd like to see a conversation linking rapid urbanization, the state of women, and the idea of peace and security and the settlement of conflict within contexts that are evolving on our continent. So that is the way in which we want this conversation to advance. And we don't want the issues pertaining to urbanization just to be about more housing, more urban planning. We want urban planning to be engendered, urban planning to see women, urban planning to make women visible and their needs visible. Yeah.
We'll pick that up in the Q&A, because I'm sure there's going to be some interesting questions, especially that you said that the new frontier for conflict now is increased urbanization and the stresses and the tension it's bringing to a number of cities as well. Madam Kama, I'd like to sort of turn to you now, and given your own profile, human rights activist, journalist, politician as well, and you're described or known as the mother of the revolution, given and the Iron Woman. I was raised in the UK, and the Iron Lady for the UK was Margaret Thatcher. So I'd like to understand what that it has a special connotation in the UK. So to hear it used with you, that's interesting as well. But you are the first Arab woman and the second Muslim woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And again, congratulations to you as well. But as a human rights activist, as a journalist, somebody who's really at the front line, I'd be sort of curious to understand your own question as to what else needs to be done to guarantee and protect the rights of women, particularly in a number of these conflict-affected regions, but even countries where there's a real tension between governments and their societies. How do we zoom in on various vulnerable groupings, and particularly the issue of around safeguarding the rights of women as well?
First of all, when we talk about women's rights, we shouldn't divide it with the human right in general. So when we talk about women's struggle in the field, we shouldn't be away from the rights of people for their expression rights, for their democratic rights, for their rights to access to education, to health, to et cetera, et cetera. So now women are struggling, especially in the Arab region, especially in Middle East, for their freedom, for their democracy. And they don't want just to portray them under the small slogan of women's rights, which is just represent women in some fake seats in parliament or in governments or any other official institutions. Now we as women in a region that suffer from dictatorship, this is the first priority from us as a women, is to free our countries from tyranny, from injustice, from terrorism. So women now are paying, the price twice. As a citizen who suffer and who sacrifice and who defend in human rights, as in general, and also at the same time who struggle against the bad traditions and the bad and wrong religious fatwas. So it's very important when we talk about defending on women's rights, we should be aware about the cause and the issues of women in the land. The woman, when she go to the street calling for freedom and the in general, for democracy in general, we should recognize that as a woman's right. And we should defend on her right to raise her voice against this tyranny. And why now we in Arab region, in Yemen, in Syria, in Libya, in Tunis, in Sudan, now most of the women are attacked by their governments, by the counter-revolution led by Saudi, Emirates, and Iran, because their call for democracy. So if we want, you are talking about 20 years after 1325 resolution on women, peace, and security, while women now fighting, sacrificing to have her, right of existence, right of democracy. And unfortunately now, most of the Western countries, most of the international community doesn't recognize their struggle. They want just her to raise the flag of, I want to have seats of the parliament, or quarter seats in the parliament, and at the end, maybe this will lead to be a decor image of under the dictatorial regimes. While most of women now are in the prison in Saudi, in Emirates, in Yemen, in Syria, in Sudan, in Libya, and they are really suffer under the chaos that, caused by the counter-revolution that are against the women's rights and the human rights. So to defend on women's rights, first, you have to defend on women's issues, women's requirements and demands for democracy and freedom.
Can I just ask you, so we've said 22 years on, but now we have this new framework, Women, Peace and Security framework. Are you suggesting that framework itself doesn't begin to address some of those issues that you've raised, or are you asking for another sort of instrument? I mean, you suggested that in terms of the international reaction towards the rights of women is not being addressed effectively. What is it specifically that you would want to see done differently in terms of the framing of the issues, the policy instruments, the tools, and whether they're effective in terms of addressing the issues that you've articulated quite strongly?
We want the implementation of the 1325 resolution. Until now, there is not that, implementation. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in addition to that, we want to recognize women's demands and requirements for justice and for democracy. And this is not included in the 1325. And we want also to guarantee accountability against those who committed crimes against women and against human rights in general. So these things should be something, to add to 1325, to, marginalize democracy and freedom and the calls of people of all society from women's rights. That is the biggest mistake that we commit. Right. And this is our battle as a woman, especially in our regions. Our battle for women's rights came from the gate of democracy. And when we call that we want this country to be free from tyranny, that means we want women's rights. There is no rights under the rule of tyrannies. There is no rights, women's rights. It's just they put women to be a decor under the rule. And this is what is happening now in Tunis, for example. Qais bin Ali, Qais bin Said, the president of Tunis, appointed a woman as a prime minister while he collapsed all the democratic institutions in Tunis. And he said, okay, now I guarantee the women's right, while he doubled the democracy in Tunis, while Tunis was the only country who, had, a great, opportunity to pass, to the future after the Arab Spring revolutions. So he destroyed it, and he make the Western governments to be smile at his coup when he just appointed a woman to be the prime minister. And we don't want women to play a decor under the rule of dictatorship.
Thank you. So this is quite an indictment of 22 years of international instruments, international policy to address the very issue about defending and safeguarding the rights of women. I'd like to sort of get your own perspective and your own observation of the international efforts to address these very issues, but also to get your own sense of the current landscape that we're facing that is actually undermining the possibilities for us to address women's rights and protections and women's agency, as the title of this particular session is asking us to do.
Sure. Thank you very much. So I want to sort of take everybody back actually to the 1990s and where the story of 1325 came from. It didn't come from the Security Council at one morning waking up and saying, women,
Exactly.
right? It really didn't.
Yeah.
Where it came from was women in Bosnia, women in Rwanda, women in Guatemala, women at that time, women in Sierra Leone, women who were doing exactly what Tawakkol is talking about, women who were fighting for peace, women who were fighting for democracy, women who were fighting for justice, and saying we need to have a voice in the places and spaces where peace and security is being determined, and our futures are being determined without us present. That was number one. Number two, this wasn't about, the agenda around this, and I think this is one of the confusions when we get into terminology, is that when we think about the contexts where you have crisis and fragility or revolution, it's not all women who have the courage to come and stand up in public, right? It's not all women who run to the problem. It ends up being a subset of women, and for me, one of the most important pieces of this work is to recognize that we have women who become peace builders. They take a rights-based approach, and at the same time, they're looking for solutions. And they are committed to nonviolence. You bring that together, and it's a cohort of women in the network that ICANN spearheads. We have networks in 40 countries. They are there. And the issue is that the kinds of problems that Tawakkol mentions, democracy, freedom, violent extremism, these are our issues. It is my issue as a woman. And frankly, if the international space or the very male-dominated space wants to constantly railroad women into talking about reproductive health or women in parliament or domestic violence, which are all big issues, right? Frankly speaking, those are men's issues. Reproductive health is my issue and it's a man's issue. Violence against women or sexual violence and conflict, it's predominantly actually a men's problem, right? So, but they constantly want to silo us, to talk about specific things, to keep us out of the main discussions around the nature of the state and how we want our societies to be framed. And so, to me, the WPS agenda is actually about women asserting their rights to be in those spaces, and to be in those spaces where it's been highly exclusive, because peace and security has been consistently determined by elite men, military and political men, in small rooms and back rooms, exactly like we have here. There's a conversation about Ukraine happening in a parallel conference space, right? Where are the women in those spaces? Who is listening to the voices of Ukrainian women? And I wanted to just share with you all here today, because we in our network, we have Ukrainians, and I asked my Ukrainian colleague, what's the message to Munich? And this is what she said. She said, please tell in Munich that here there are people living with children. They live here. And there is nothing more than the valuableness of human life. And there's nothing more terrible when children are scared and you cannot guarantee their safety. That is from the ground in Ukraine. That's what people on the ground are thinking about. While here the conversation is already, there is a war and what are we going to do about it? I mean, it's like the situation in Yemen. Yemen suddenly becomes a place where either it's humanitarian or military weapons. It's not about the people, right? The WPS agenda and the perspective that women from the ground bring is they humanize it. They don't just talk about women, they talk about men, they talk about the boys, they talk about their sons, they talk about the elderly, they talk about the needs of everybody. And I'll give you a quote from one of my Sudanese colleagues some years ago. She said, in South Sudan, women don't have time to die. And we said, can you explain this? And she said, well, our young men are killing each other. Our elders are so devastated by what's happened to our society and our communities that they're actually getting ill and getting sick and dying. And it's women who are left to deal with the problems and feeding people and making sure that everybody is okay. So women are at the center of all of this stuff. And yet, when it comes to the highest levels at the international level or the governmental levels, we have had 20 years of what I would call the AAA syndrome, of ad hocery, apathy, and amnesia. So good things get done, but we don't systematize it. Somebody good comes into a position, we have strong, commitment. The next person comes in, they forget about it and they become apathetic. The agenda in and of itself is now 10 resolutions. There are 51% of the United Nations member states have national action plans on women, peace, and security. The OSCE, the AU, everywhere you go, we have the policies. But the policies are like a Swiss Army knife. It's a set of tools. If you have the tools and then you have the problem, but you're not applying the tools to the problem festers and gets worse, and the tools are sitting there. We can criticize the tools as much as we want, or add to them as much as we want, but unless those who have power actually start to use those tools and implement them and make them real, we can't blame the fact that the tools don't work. So there is this tension. And just to answer your question, Afghanistan was a watershed moment for all of us, because we've talked about peace builder. Afghan women wanted to be in Doha for the negotiations. They were systematically excluded. And the truth of the matter is, if Afghan peace builders, women peace builders, had been in Doha 8 years ago, 4 years ago, even 2 years ago, we would not have the Afghanistan that we have right now. And that's the message, that's the image that we have to think about. What would it be like if we had today Syrian women sitting at the table, Yemeni women who've been developing a feminist roadmap for peace, actually driving the agenda for the international community around how to do peace building in Yemen and end the war. These are the things that we need to be thinking about. Instead, we have Afghan women completely left aside, Afghan women in the security forces that our governments told them to go and join at high risk. No government has picked up the threat that Afghan women peace builders, Afghan women army officers, Afghan women in the government, Afghan women in the police force are facing because of our failures as an international community to get the politics right. So the onus is now at an international level, and we need the powerful to step up and take up the responsibility to protect, because civil society is doing it, and civil society is getting crushed in the process.
Well, please do. Go ahead. Yeah.
Add something about Afghan women. Really, what's happened in Afghanistan, and I think that my belief that it's handovering the authority to Taliban. What happened in Afghanistan is a very big lesson that, unfortunately, and sorry if I blame a lot, the Western government, the democratic states, that they always claim, and that they are supporting democracy, they are supporting women's rights, and when it came to the reality, they don't. And what happened in Afghanistan that gave us the biggest evidence, women in Afghanistan did a great work to help Afghan people, to help human rights, to do any effort to make Afghanistan as a democrat country, as a democrat country. But what happened? America and Western government, especially America, hand over the authority to Taliban. That means even if women in Afghanistan be part of the negotiation, that means that their cause was collapsed. Their cause, their issues, all their struggle, all the rule, under the rule of Taliban before, and also after while the war, was collapsed. When you hand over the authority to this fascist group who against democracy and against women's rights, that means that women's rights is the last thing that those democrat countries think about it. And also the democracy is the last thing that they think about. The same thing with our country, when they make alliance with dictatorship, when they make alliance with the Prince Crown of Saudi Arabia, while he put tens of women in the prison, while he waged, and the Prince Crown of Emirates, while he waged war in Yemen, who killed women and children. So this is unfortunately women in the region, in the countries that suffer from conflicts, that suffer from tyranny, are really alone, and will not stop their struggle. They will continue their struggle until they reach to the democracy and freedom.
Thank you very much for that. And it's a shame you weren't at this breakfast meeting that we had this morning, Samaba, and it was called the age of impunity and how to address accountability in the age of impunity. And one of the most striking comments that was made in that session, and we have a number of our colleagues here that represent different governments and international organizations. One of the themes that came out of that was about how we needed to clean up our own house, and how we needed to deal essentially with the double standards and the hypocrisy. And you're throwing a challenge now to a number of friends and allies who believe in these issues, but you're asking them to look at themselves as well in terms of how they implement their policy or in terms of the allies they support. But Minister, I wanted to ask you one question, because Samar, you said that civil society is doing its work, and that we need the people who are powerful to begin to rethink their own strategies as well. But we have a powerful woman here in our minister, and I wanted to ask you, from a practical level, how do you build a community of among the other female ministers, for example, to coalesce when you see the rights of women being undermined in a number of these conflict, in these number of these hotspots? I don't want to suggest that it should be a burden that you carry, but you do occupy, in the eyes of many, a powerful position that gives you certain vantage point. Do you see that position that you occupy as giving you an ability to drive further the women, peace and security agenda, particularly at the level of at the UN, and particularly because Kenya occupies a seat as a non-permanent member at the UN Security Council now?
To my mind, you need a bottom-up approach, really. You need to take the principles that are part of Resolution 1325, the idea of the protection of women, the prevention of conflict, the participation of women, and make those real to women on the grassroots. The power is with the women at the grassroots. And to my mind, you can talk about resolutions. You can gather as so-called women of power and discuss these issues by yourselves. But the main thing is to translate them to issues that are of concern to women where they are. Our obligation is to empower women where they are, to ensure that women's agency is felt in the lives of ordinary people, and to ensure that we are able to decipher and break down and unpack these ideas to women where they are, so that you begin to get understanding, and so that you can then respond to the needs of women directly. Often when we talk about these things at international level, we miss out on what women really need. So that's why I'm saying we need to invest in women at the grassroots. We need to ask, what is your problem? How do we address it within the context of Resolution 1325? I think one of the biggest challenges of Resolution 1325 is that the way in which it is managed is through national action plans. And those national action plans may be not properly budgeted for. They may be too far away from the women on the ground. But having said that, it's important to also use platforms of power to draw attention to the plight of women, whether you're sitting as a member of the United Nations Security Council, whether you're sitting at the AU Peace and Security Council or wherever. It's essential that the voices of women are heard, and that whenever issues are brought to the table, we are able to look at them from a gender perspective, so that people don't forget that women are suffering. People don't forget that as you're sitting down talking about the drumbeats of war being beaten, that the eventual victims will probably be a woman and a child somewhere. But I think even as we look at 1325, we must look at it as a tool for strengthening communities. And we must see women as part of their communities. So even as we are trying to empower women in their agency, we've got to empower their families. We've got to empower communities. In Africa, you can't build separate communities. You have to bring everyone together because the challenge of peace, the challenge of conflicts affects whole communities. So often, we have two challenges. One, to make women salient, and two, to look at these things from the perspective of where you come from. Peace and security, conflict resolution are not the same everywhere. They're not homogeneous. So you have to be able to look at it within your context and to bring the solutions from where you are to the table. So we are looking for an African peace. And that's what we talk about when we are at the United Nations Security Council. We talk about an African peace. Yeah.
Thank you, Minister. Just want to remind our participants that you can use the QR code to send through some questions, although we can also go the traditional route, which is to put your hands up as well. But I want to now turn to our very first sort of commentator from the session. And I want to recognize you, Madame Schulz, Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development from the federal government of Germany. And Germany has been a leading champion of 1325, but also the Women, Peace and Security agenda, whether it's within the European Union, within the United Nations, in all its spheres. And I wanted to ask you to get your own reflections of where we are today in terms of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. What do you see as sort of the weaknesses, but where do you see opportunities to help deal, for example, with some of the ground realities that we've just heard from Ms. Karma, because it's a very stark message that she's providing to us that 22 years on, the realities of a number of women in these frontline countries, whether it's in Yemen, in Sudan, in Saudi Arabia, you listed a raft of countries, what that means at the policy level in terms of advancing the role of women as agencies in peace and security. Thank you, Madame Schulz.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much. We see that 20 years after we have this resolution 1325, we are not at the aim. We need to do a lot of more to have women represented in a way that is fair, to having more respect for women. I think that it's also a question of respect, having more representation, having more resources for women, and also more equal rights. And that's all that we need, that we still not have 20 years after we have this discussion, 20 years we decided to have this UN resolution. So there is still a lot of work to do, and I think I absolutely agree, and I like to underline it. We need it in all issues of politics. It's not about women's politics, it's about foreign politics. We are convinced in the German government that the foreign politics of the future, the foreign policy of future, needs to be a feminist policy. That the future development policy needs to meet a feminist development policy. So we have met with Annalena Baerbock now a foreign minister, a woman. We have a defense minister, Christine Lambrecht, and we have a development minister. The faces to the world in Germany are now women, and we want to make that and really an issue that counts in all fields of politics. And that's about networking. We hear that before. I think it is really important that we have these networks. And we have this action network on forced displacement, women as agents of change that we bring forward on the international level. I think that is a possibility to give women a voice. That is one part, having this networking. But the second part is, I think we need to dismantle patriarchal power structures. There are structures where men support each other. There are structures in the societies that we have to dismantle and talk about it, make it very transparent that we want to change it and bring that forward in governments, because they are the roots of many serious human rights violations, both in peace times and during conflicts. So dismantle the power structures and making feminist policy in all the fields we are engaged in. I think that are two ways to bring Resolution 1325 really to life.
I like the way you characterised it, that you said you didn't want to focus on women's policy, but to feminise the international arena and foreign policy. And I know, Saman, you want to respond to that. So I'll give you the right of way, and then I want to talk to Ms. Hannah Newman as well.
I think the sort of just as a dovetailing of that, you know, what we've had in the last 20 years is the securitizing of humanity with the counterterrorism agenda. We need to flip it, and we need to humanize security. So it goes back to what the minister was saying about in our urban settings, you need to have security for women. So, you know, whether it's street lights or whether it's good policing or whether it's access to food and water, and just, but that human security lens is very much part of the feminist approaches. But I wanted to just give a couple of very practical examples. So, when we talk about the local and the grassroots, what I found in the network that we've been spearheading, which is now Women Peacebuilders organizations in 40 countries, including in Kenya and Yemen and elsewhere, is that as peacebuilders, they are reaching out and working with the local government, with marginalized communities, with armed actors where they exist, and they have built a level of trust. And trust has been really critical because it's the missing piece in many of our governance issues. When COVID happened, and the international community disappeared, especially from fragile countries, it was these women who were the first responders to providing masks, making PPE, covering. The WHO was talking about the importance of washing your hands with soap and water. In my network, our Cameroonian partners were saying, we don't have soap or water. In Somalia, they were saying, we can't afford soap. Our Pakistani colleagues were telling them how to make soap from natural products. What we have right now is, whether it's the ICANN network or others, we have locally rooted women's organizations, women's networks that are then globally connected, and we're talking horizontally to each other. This is something that we need the international community to support. And we need the support directly to our global movements, because if it only goes into the UN system, it becomes politicized, and frankly, a lot of the money disappears.
Can I just ask you, and I'm going to come to Madam Newman, what specifically, though, are you asking the international community to support?
Yeah, two things. Money directly to women's movements that is flexible and sustainable over the years, like 2 or 3 years. It can't just be that you get, you know, we put money into the UN system and it goes into a black hole, which many of us don't see, and then, you know, $9 million there versus $200,000 to a network and all sorts of restrictions on the money in the same way. So if we're serious, we need to resource it seriously and support movements. Support movements, because we're much more agile in terms of getting the resources. That's number one. Number two, on the question of practically what we do, take the issue of sexual violence. Okay, this is a big problem. 2 weeks ago, we did a Twitter call to say, can we name 10 men in the world, senior military and political levels, who have taken on the issue of conflict-related sexual violence as a serious issue? We couldn't come up with 10 names. Globally, we could not find 10 men in our political and military structures that are dealing with this problem. It's a big problem. And one of the things that I would suggest is, let's bring it back and think about it in terms of, first of all, sexual violence by our own security forces, by state actors, police and army. This is a big problem in Uganda, in Nigeria, in Iran, I'm sure in Yemen. It's a huge problem. We could be mobilizing our local women's organizations, our networks, to say, to have a dialogue with the police, to say, do you promise that you won't rape, you won't harass, you won't abuse women who come to you? I mean, will the police in our various countries sign a sign to say they won't do that? Because if they're not willing to sign that, that's a big problem, right? But you can have that grassroots approach to say, here are the issues that this is how we want to be treated by our own security forces. You take it to the national level and globally, and we watch that. If our own state actors behave better, we are in a better position to then challenge the non-state actors. This is where the hypocrisy and the questions come back to roost. And I'll end with this. In Nigeria, the Boko Haram women that our partner has been dealing with, the women who were, girls who were abducted, raped, abused, brainwashed, forced to become suicide bombers, and then they somehow didn't make it, and were put in a IDP camp. All of them were raped by Nigerian security forces as well, right? Now, they had the courage to go to the military academy and actually talk to the military leadership and say, you know what, this is happening. It's not just Boko Haram, it's also your guys. So let's stop the abuse by our own security and our own state actors. I think that would make a huge difference in terms of building trust and the question of enabling and empowering communities. It's coming from the ground up. And then we move on to the rest of it. But at the moment, as Tawakkol said, nobody cares. And we have to, at least let's be honest about that it's all rhetoric. The only people who care are women themselves.
Thanks, Emma. I've got some questions here, but before I go to the questions, Madame Hannah Newman, Chairwoman of the Delegation of Relations with the Arab Peninsula, the Greens, and EFA Parliamentary Group, the European Parliament. I'd like to give you the floor for your own sort of comments and observations.
Thank you. And as a politician that sees herself very committed on Resolution 1325, the last year has been a challenging one, especially with regards on what we saw in Afghanistan. And one thing is the dramatic events on the ground, but for someone who slowly learns that I'm part of the powerful, the question also is how do we escape ad hoc and apathy this time? And what has been most striking for me is we have kind of, maybe it was our own way out. So there are no powerful women is what people say, why they are not at the decision-making table. It has never been made a priority. When it comes to Afghanistan last year, there are incredibly powerful women, we know them, and it has seriously been on everyone's priority, and still we messed up. So I have scrutinized my brain for 6 months now on what are things why we messed up and what could we do differently. And I know like the big media is moving on to Ukraine and Russia, but I would like to use 3 minutes here to share my thoughts, and maybe they can enrich some of the discussion here and complement the view from on the ground. For me, the first one, language and stereotypes. How often did I hear, well-intentioned, we need to give the women a voice? Well, these women have a voice, we should give them a stage and a microphone and fucking listen to them. Yes. The second one, and that's a stereotype which is quite an easy way out, it's a religious thing. The biggest Islamic country is Indonesia. This country is governed by a female prime minister. Never ever tell me it's a religious thing, and for us, never ever just give up on it because we think it's a religious thing, we shouldn't meddle. Second aspect, and it boils down again to representation, but I'm going to do some different aspects of representation. First one, storytelling. How much have we heard about why the Afghan military man walked away? How much discussion do we have now if Ashraf Ghani is coming back? Who is standing in Kabul right now with bare hands looking in the barrel of the guns? It's the women. Do we see them? No, we don't. The other one about representation, yes, it was the Taliban, even in their PR press conference, already saying women don't have a role in politics. What did our delegations look like when we went there to tell them that women should have a role in politics? Men. We need to deal with the Taliban, fair enough, so we need to do Oslo. Well, I don't think they need to fly in luxury jets, and if we bring them there, they shouldn't take pictures. But okay, we need to have these discussions. We should have the same discussion with women, but with a more representation, more attention, more glitter. And the last aspect is how do we ourselves become part of the shrinking space that women have in these regions? And that's a discussion we should sincerely have. Just one example, Schengen visa. So there's this opportunity for people, for women's rights defenders, if they want to go for networks, for conferences, they can apply for Schengen visa. So it's a 3 months visa to the European Union. if you're not a celebrity woman, but just a random woman from your networks, what happens? You go to one of these implementing agencies, they run it by the handbook. Do you know what's the first criteria on the handbook? Have you ever been in conflict with the state authority? Do you know what's the second one? Have you ever been in prison? Do you know what's the third one? Do you have a regular income? And do you know what's the fourth one? Are you married? So by definition of being a human rights defender in a country with a shrinking or closed space, you're not getting a Schengen visa. And we have quite a number of these policies, so we also have a homework to do. And Tawakkol, you said it, Hannah is the name that means, well, the biggest optimism possible. Despite that we messed it up, we kind of have some ideas on why.
Thank you very much, Hannah. And that was just very clear. And I liked your line about representation and who is representing who as well, and who's speaking on whose behalf. I have 3 questions now for our panelists, but I'd also welcome to hear views from other people who haven't had a chance to put their hands up, and I'm conscious with the people that are behind me. But the very first question is, I mean, in a sense, we've discussed it, but I'm quite happy for us to sort of drill down again, especially Madame Schultz, when you talked about an international feminist agenda. The question is, what is the role of public discourse for women's agency in foreign policy? And I mean, conversations take place at multiple levels as well. But when, Minister, you said that we should bring it back to the grassroots, and when you talk about urbanization, and when you said we need to make sure that we're having these conversations in our communities, based from your standpoint, Minister, what is the role of public discourse for women's agencies in foreign policy, given your own role as a foreign minister?
Well, public discourse, if it's going to be public, must include women as that public. So the first conversations you need to have are with women themselves. You need to have conversations that take place not just nationally, but regionally and internationally. One of the biggest disconnects that I see is that there are different perspectives of what women, peace, and security mean. And the international community gives priority to different arenas where women are suffering. And some women are forgotten. So to ensure that you're having these conversations and the conversations are poignant and relevant, you must remember to speak of women at the international space. You must remind the international community to look at the suffering of women holistically. But we also have to involve men in this conversation. And one thing I thought was quite incisive is a recent conference that was held in Africa by presidents that was bringing in the voices of men in the issue of violence against women. So there's a need to include all voices in this conversation if we're going to get holistic solutions. We need to teach our young diplomats about the role of women in peace and security. We need to build up a body of diplomats who are sensitive to issues pertaining to women's peace and security. You find that in many foreign service institutes, the question of Resolution 1325 is not even taught, it's not even recognized. You'll find that in the training of policemen and police women and defense personnel, gender studies are not taught, and if they are taught, they're taught in a very theoretical way. So you need to be able to drill down so that certain principles are held sacrosanct. And when you get that type of networking, then you begin to get the sort of sensitivities that you need across society to be able to deal with the principles that are embedded in Resolution 1325, so that they come alive, so that they're not just theoretical pronouncements, but are things that make sense to the policeman as he's dealing with a woman demonstrator, for instance, that he understands that what she's agitating for is space in her society. And the way to deal with her is not to rape her or to lock her up. So you need that kind of churn in society to bring about those fundamental changes. But often we don't have enough data. And because we don't have enough data, we actually lack understanding as to the depth of understanding, as to the depth of the embracing of these ideas in our society. So I think we need to research more. We need to have more conversations with women. We need to have more conversations with men. We need to have more conversations at the regional level. And it's only when we collect data that we then understand what women need. We then understand what they have learned. We then understand what their aspirations are. So it's a complex subject, and it's not one that we should take lightly. And not everyone is to blame. And I don't think it's right for us to say that 1325 has failed. It hasn't failed. What is happening to 1325 is that it is being renewed, it's being refreshed, it's being made relevant to various conflict situations all the time. And when we talk about failure, we then diminish the work that so many women have done to advance Resolution 1325. So my view is to work harder, engage more, make the principles relevant, and move forward as a collective and understand that it's not just the role of governments, it's not just the role of foreign ministers, it's everybody's business. Peace and security is everybody's business.
Thank you, and that's just a very, very, very clear line, and I'm glad you ended with that note, because it's an important one that needs to be reinforced time and time again. I'd like to bring Minister Schultz back into the conversation, because this next question popped up the minute you made your statement about wanting to dismantle patriarchy, and so I think that the person who asked the question then is asking you, I believe, is asking you, what should men's role be in defending women's rights as well? So I'd like to sort of get your views on that. I'm going to come back to you.
What should men's role be? I think men, we need them. They are an integral part of politics, but they need to realize that there is no peace when women are not in peace. There is no development of a country when there is no development for the women, and that the half of the society need to be involved, and that is not the fact all over the world, and therefore the Resolution 1325 is still helpful, is still something we need, but we need men to fight with us against the problems we have. We will not convince everybody, no. But if we get more than the 10 you mentioned before, then that is something that counts. And so discussing that at the Munich Security Conference, I think that is a step forward. Do you imagine 10 years before a Munich Security Conference discussing about the role of women? I don't think so. So speeding that up, that is more in the center of politics for everyone, not only for the women. Men also have to bring that forward.
I have one more. You're just controlling the mic, or you have a question to ask? I have one question for both of you, and somehow I'm going to allow you the right to intervene. But you can also wrap up your question in what I'm going to ask you both, because I was struck by your Twitter survey your comments, and maybe there are other platforms, and you may get one or two. I had one or two countries in my head, but I don't need to defend them. They can defend themselves. But this question to both of you is, which countries can serve as best practice examples in promoting women's rights and agency domestically as well as globally as well? Do you want me to repeat it again?
No, I heard it.
Yeah. I raise it
I have
specifically
very high
to you.
standards about which countries. I mean, I think there are questions around whether we mean domestically or whether we mean internationally, right? So, domestically, obviously, countries like Norway and Sweden and others are doing a great job in this grand. I'm sure Norwegian women will have lots of things that they would like to improve, but overall, I think we're seeing certain practices there. And to that extent, I would also say in terms of aspects of their foreign policy, we see certain things. The problem that I see with this agenda, including here in Munich, is that it's siloed. You're right, 10 years ago, I was definitely not invited. 2 years ago, I was just about invited. Who knows whether I'll be invited next year. But the issue is that these conversations should be part of the main stage of us discussing whether it's helplessness or hopelessness or whatever the solutions are, right? We need to be talking with the rest of the community. That's number one. And then secondly, coming back to this question of men, I'll just give you two examples. My nephew some years ago had a class on feminism in his school. He went to a boys' school. So he came along and he was telling me about feminism, and I said, so what is it? And he said, it's about equality, gender equality. So I said, okay, so are you a feminist? And he was very reluctant to admit that he believed in equality, but now he could actually be a feminist. Somehow the word feminist was too far to go, for whatever reason. So then I said to him, look, I work on an agenda called Women, Peace and Security, and our agenda is that when we think about equality, what I'm fighting for is that it's not just the equal rights of my daughters to also be drafted to go to war alongside the boys. I'm fighting for the equality so that you as a boy don't have to suffer going to war and seeing that violence and that trauma. That's the transformative nature of this agenda. It is about violence prevention. It's about war prevention. It's about thinking about how we resolve conflicts non-violently, domestically or internationally. And we need to put that front and center of the discussions. It's really critical. And going back to the question of where are we and so forth, I've seen 20 years ago, 25 years ago, my uncle was the only person in my family who supported what I was doing. He was the only one who's like, women waging peace? Yes, I'm a man who's supporting women waging peace, right? I went to Garissa in Kenya in 2009, and I met Somali elders. And we were talking about issues of violence and terrorism and climate change and migration and people being displaced. And I said to them, and as we were slowly talking about these issues, I said to them, what are your core concerns in your communities? Without a prompt, these elders turned around and they said, gender-based violence is our core concern. It's our core business. They were seeing violence in their own communities, right? So I think that there are plenty of men out there who are engaged and who would actually welcome the opportunity to be able to be part of this conversation. We have partners all over the world who are working with Islamic leaders, local chiefs, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't bring them into the conversation, and we don't make it actually a safe space for them to talk about the violence and trauma they've experienced as well. Yeah. It is part and parcel of this agenda, but we need to elevate the idea of peace for all of us. And I think this is the sort of the essence of where this issue goes. And when we say talking about gender lens, it's if you want to understand violent extremism and you don't take a gender lens and understand how they co-opt women and how they coerce women or how they tap into men's masculine insecurities, young men's masculine insecurities, you've missed the boat on understanding why radicalization happens. It is integral to how these movements are evolving. We need to have these conversations in the mainstream spaces.
Minister, you made an important point that I don't want anybody to lose sight of, and you said it's not as though we're talking about a homogeneous group of women, and that women, there are different women's groups, different interests, and you made the reference also about urban. There's also differences between the rural and urban women as well, and I thought it's an important point not to sort of dismiss, but to underline as well. One question for you, and please feel free to answer the other question as well. I mean, it's a question that we've received from the digital space. What can women from the north learn from women in the south? But I'd like to add to that as well, because it goes back to what I said about, you know, viewing women as in homogeneous groups. But even in the south as well, there are different opinions about, you know, women's agency as well. So we shouldn't classify us as being all in one group. So I'd be very curious to hear your perspective. And again, I go back to the fact that you talked about, you mentioned Sudan, you mentioned Yemen, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, you mentioned Libya, but in all those societies, there are different perspectives that women bring to the issue, and I'd like to sort of get your opinion on that.
Look, returning back to 1325 resolution, which also mentioned that the importance of women to be in the decision making positions. Unfortunately, until now, there is a lot of women around the world who led their countries, especially even in the north, even in the democratic countries. But also there is some potential. Now we have, before we have Angela Merkel, who did a great work, and now we have a foreign affairs minister. We have now in the U.S. the vice president of the U.S., which is Kamala Harris. So we have now a good faces that lead some countries in the Europe, in the north, in the what called democratic countries. Those women, we are waiting a lot from those women. For me, the best, country who will serve women's rights, especially under the leadership of women, is the country who will help those people who suffer from oppression to stand against those, oppression, against those, dictators. The one who will help me as a Yemeni on stopping the war in Yemen. I wait a lot from Kamala Harris. I wait a lot from the German foreign affairs minister, and I wait a lot from any woman leader in the world to lead the real struggle to stop the war in Yemen. And how? While they have the, a good position and they have a voice and ability, by stopping selling weapons to those dictators in the region who killed people in Yemen, by stopping sold weapons to Saudi and Emirates, by making a very serious pressure on Houthi militia backed from Iran on, to stop their coup in Yemen and to stop their violation against Yemenis. So I'm waiting a lot from those women. So when we call women to be in the decision-making position, we are waiting a lot from her as a woman to serve democracy, to serve freedom, and to serve human rights. In my region, in all other regions who suffer from lack of democracy, the first thing, the first priority for us to reach to the women's rights, as I said before, first to reach to the democracy at all that will guarantee rights for men and women. Second, to guarantee the representation of women, at least to be half in the in the all institutions of the authority. But this should be as a result of a real democratic process, not as I said before, and as I will usually repeat that, not to make women to be a decor that beautifies the face of tyrannies.
I really do like this and I'm really glad you said it again. Not to make women a decor, a decoration, and it's the old argument of you add women and stir and assume that you solve the problem. you've solved the problem as well. I'd like to give, because I don't see any more questions, and we are coming close to 1 o'clock, but I'd like to give concluding remarks to Christina Luntz, who is a co-CEO and co-founder of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, and sort of give your own wrap-up conclusions and observations and remarks of what you've heard from our panelists, but your own sort of thoughts on the debate.
Thank you so much. It's a huge honor for me to actually be speaking here with such remarkable women. I applaud all of you. Thank you for saying and doing everything you've just said and you've been doing. And also Hannah, being the feminist at the European Parliament and our new feminist development minister. It's such a joy. It's such a joy to have like you, Svenja Schulze, and then Annalena Baerbock and Christine Lambrecht, like such feminist, outspoken, clear, strong ministers. It's a new era and it's very special. Thank you for that. So I'm the co-founder of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, and we started our work 4 years ago. That's not long. And we have women sitting here who've been working on the topic for decades. And I already feel like I can't believe I still have to protest this shit and talk about these things, right? And then we have others who are actually the mothers of the 1325 agenda. You know, I want conversations to take place differently. I don't want panels and town halls focusing on women in conflict. I want to talk about how is it actually possible, like how has patriarchy, and thank you for bringing up patriarchal structures, how have they led to a fact that we only started talking about sexualized violence in conflict in the 90s, when sexualized violence in conflict has been around since conflicts have been around. But the reason is because the international law, it's patriarchal. International law is the law by states for states, and by states for states has meant by men for men. So the needs of women and other politically marginalized groups, they've not been at the center. So it was only in the 90s. That is not long ago. And it is, when we talk about sexualized violence, it's, for example, in Germany, the leader of the biggest opposition party now, he in 1997, he still opposed making rape in the marriage illegal. Like, these are the structures we need to talk about. We need to talk about, like, get back to the shoulders of the giants that we're standing on. It's great we're having these conversations here, but those conversations, they've been taking place for more than 100 years. It was in 1915 that 1,200 feminists came together in The Hague and demanded an end to the First World War, but also published 20 resolutions that first, and which included democratizing diplomacy, because the history of diplomacy is the history of exclusion of women and other politically marginalized people. It also included, first and foremost, disarmament and the end of the military-industrial complex. And this is what we talk about. It's so, I've always been wondering, like, how is it even possible we, as countries, we have as the main goal sustainable peace, but then at the same time, like my country, Germany is the 4th biggest arms exporter in the world. Like, this is just like, that is unintegra, like that, there's no integrity when we say these things. And I would like to see conversations about how has patriarchy messed up international politics on the main stage next year. And when we change the narrative and the debate, then we'll have more people and also more interest, because this is like, it's those conversations that actually cause a little bit of rupture, and we need rupture. Rupture is always needed if we want societal change, otherwise there's no change. And the things I really want to talk about is that over the past couple of days, there were investigative journalism reports talking about how the Munich Security Conference might have been a platform for arms deals and facilitate those, when at the same time we're trying to talk about women in conflict. These are the conversations we need to have, like about the patriarchal systems and how they've created this very unjust world. Thank you, ladies, for all your work you're doing.
Thank you very much, Christina. And you raised an interesting, well, you made an interesting comment there about the place of Germany And with its feminist foreign policy, I'm assuming that you're going to be advocating for certain changes as well. I don't see any more questions coming in from the floor or from our digital space. But Minister, I wanted to ask if you had sort of any concluding remarks of your own as well before we close.
What would I say? Don't give up on the agency of women. Don't underrate women, and don't assume that because the women's battle is a slow one, it will never be won. We have examples of women who have done extraordinary things against the odds. And I think 1325 will come to pass in its own shape, in its own style, as women begin to embrace and understand it. She has indicated that there have been very many movements, in places like Sudan, where women have not given up, and they're not going to give up, and something's going to give. And that tells us that it's a long journey, but it's a journey for those whose hearts are strong. And they will be pitfalls, but women will prevail. So that would be my message.
That's a great way to end, Minister, and I want to thank you for that, because precisely as we speak right now, the people at the front lines of the protest in Sudan are not going to stop protesting are the women, whether it's in the resistance committees and in various groupings as well. I do want on this note also to recognize one woman that I know has been a champion on the continent alongside with you is Minister Pandor for International Relations of South Africa. And when South Africa was at the Security Council, I know that she made this, the issue of women, peace and security a common platform for South Africa. So, Minister, I do want to recognize you, and thank you.
Comfort, can I just
we do have a few minutes, Minister, and I do know that this has been a central platform for you in South Africa, and South Africa has really played a very prominent role on the continent internationally. So I'd like to see if we can give the mic to the Minister to give her the last few words as well.
Comfort, can I just have one more?
Let me get the Minister.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was enjoying not saying anything, so you've really put me on the spot. I think a lot has been said, but the key issue for me is that we need to recognize that wherever there is inequality and where women do not enjoy human rights, we should be interested. I worry that sometimes our interest peaks when it suits our foreign policy agenda. So when we've got a particular angst against Russia, we're interested in women in Ukraine, but we forget women in Palestine who've been suffering for over 7 decades. So I think if we're concerned about human rights, it must be a concern that exists until all women enjoy full human rights. Then the struggle means something. Otherwise, we are particularizing, we're selecting because it's a political agenda. It's not a true commitment to everyone enjoying access to humanity. And for me, I think that is the key issue. I come from a country where we have very, very high levels of sexual violence against women, a very, very bad record of femicide, and it's something that we are struggling to combat. We need to change the way men think about women, how they perceive women, but we also have to address the residue that results from the experience of violence that young men grow up with and which they take into adulthood, and it translates into how they treat women. So there's a lot of work we need to do to change our societies and the way in which we perceive each other. I also think that part of the changes we need to inculcate is the true meaning of gender. That gender has become equal to women, whereas it is men and women or boys and girls. And it is important when we talk gender equality that we're changing both the praxis and perception of women and men, boys and girls. Then we're talking about gender equality. But really, the final point I reiterate is, and by the way, we didn't mention Namibia when we talk Resolution 1325, and they played such an important role in advancing that particular resolution within the UN Security Council. We do a lot of work in South Africa. We have a program called the Gertrude Shope Women in Dialogue Program. It's dedicated to one of our struggle veterans, Meg Gertrude Shope. We offer training to women throughout the continent on the skills of conflict resolution and post-conflict reconstruction. Initially, it began as a program focused on societies newly emerging from conflict, but it became of great interest to our own local women in our communities who wanted that kind of training so that they could address conflict within their own community. And so it's become a program that involves both women from civil society in South Africa, women in organized formations addressing gender-based violence, but also women from South Sudan and all over the continent where conflict exists. The key issue is it's important that while we teach these skills, we must also ensure that as women emerge from conflict, they have in their armor of what should be in the transition a sense of a Bill of Rights, a sense of a constitution and its content, and the degree to which it is gendered in its shape. So all of these must be part of what we as organized women ensure is on the ground. And really the answer for me in terms of changing attitudes in society is organization, organization, organization.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. And we've come to the end of our session. I really want to thank you, the three of you, plus our commentators, Katrina, Madame Schultz, Madame Newman, and also Minister Pandor, for really a very, 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 just very compelling analysis and feedback and rethinking the conversation. Thank you all very much as well. Thank you.
Thank you.